Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin. I'm the training coordinator with the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and I'd like to welcome you to our CTP Information Exchange webinar today. We're going to be discussing 2D modeling outreach. We have three great presenters to go through this topic with you. Before we get into the topic at hand, though, a few administrative items I'll go over. If you've joined us before for these quarterly events, you may be used to these, but bear with me, there's some useful information here. So first thing I just want to mention is that we've got a big audience for these, so we obviously can't have lines unmuted for all 500 or so of you, but we do want you to engage with us. So if you have questions, comments about anything you see today, please find the Q&A feature here within the Zoom software, and that's where we'll take questions. There's also a chat section. Sometimes people put questions there. I'll try to keep up with those, but the Q&A feature is where we can stay a little bit more organized and on task with questions. If you have those, drop them there. Next thing, just want to let people know this is eligible for CECs. If you're a CFM, a national level CFM, we'll issue that to you automatically. Okay, that's going to take us about a week to turn around, but after that time, you'll see that in your CFM record. For those of you who are attending for another purpose, another licensure, or you're in an accredited state or what have you, I'll also be sending certificates of attendance out to anyone who sticks with us for the duration today and participates fully. You'll get that certificate. So if you don't get the credit for whatever reason, you'll have that certificate to claim it later on. Also want to let people know we are recording this event, and that recording will get distributed at the time of the certificates as well. So look out for an email from me in about a week, and it'll have all that kind of information and any additional promised follow-up from the event today. Finally, just want to let everyone know these are quarterly events, and we are on the lookout for topics. So if you think anything would be particularly relevant or timely, or you know something that you know you want to learn about, go ahead and drop us a line, and we'll see if we can make that happen for you. Without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Alan Luloff in our Flood Science Center to talk a little bit about our CTP subcommittee, their work, and our topic for today. So Alan, go ahead and take it away.
Hello. Yes, this is a set of webinars that we provide for the CTP subcommittee. ASFPM created a subcommittee in, I think it was 2014, of the Mapping and Engineering Standards Committee. It's co-chaired by Joanna Rolfe and Manuel Razo. With Joanna's with Kansas and Manny's with Texas. You can see here the goals of our webinars. I also want to mention that I see people saying hello in the chat. You do not have to put anything in the chat to be recognized as attending this webinar. That's done in a different fashion. So the chat feature doesn't help with that. So today we've got some very good presenters, especially the first one. Oh, sorry, that's me. And then we have Bill Brown. He's also with the ASFPM Flood Science Center, and Sydney Roberts. She's with the state of Missouri. And with that, I have to share my screen.
Looks good, Alan.
Okay, what we're talking about today is some ASFPM 2D modeling outreach that we prepared. The project team is shown here. It was myself, Jenna Moran, and Bill Brown. And first, just want to highlight the vision and mission of the ASFPM, mainly to provide, try to mitigate flood losses, and also to protect the natural and beneficial functions of floodplains, all without causing adverse impacts. Here's a graphic showing our membership. as of May 2025. You can see the membership across the country. The state with the largest membership is Florida with 1,008, and then after that it's Colorado with 408. The Flood Science Center is within ASFPM, and it's a center that focuses on doing applied research. And one of the major features we've done since about 2010, we've established an ASFPM library. And I don't, some of you may remember Les Bond. He highlighted the need for us to have a presence so that our publications can be properly archived and made available via our library. And you can see here some of the external partners we've established relationships with over the years. Of course, FEMA, but also NOAA, the Coastal States Organization, APA, and several others. So I mentioned a little bit about the ASFPM CTP subcommittee, and we're funded by FEMA to kind of support the Cooperating Technical Partner Program, one of which is the subcommittee, and we hold the routine calls with the subcommittee to discuss future webinars. And we get about 700 attendees on our webinars on average. So it's got quite a good following. We're very pleased with that. We do outreach work as associated with this project here. I'm going to be talking about today, the 2D modeling outreach. And then we also conduct training via webinars and on-site training sessions. So this project is focusing on 2D modeling outreach, and the three components of this project were to access and review some FEMA-approved 2D models, which was a bit of a challenge because while the 2D modeling is becoming more popular, not a lot of them have gone through the whole FEMA process to get them on actually a flood insurance rate map. We then did some interviewing with communities that had received maps developed with 2D modeling. And then we've developed some outreach materials associated with that. So here's a map of the country that shows, three of the locations where we obtained 2D models, one in Colorado, one in South Dakota, and the other in Kentucky. And then here's a list of communities, the first 5 of which were in those 3 project areas. And then we also interviewed Carson River Watershed District in Nevada. And the reason for that is they developed some 2D models through their CTP program. And what's interesting about them is that they became a cooperating technical partner mainly because they wanted to have more kind of control of the mapping process. And the top 5 communities, when we interviewed those communities, they basically were not aware when they first received the maps that they were developed with 2D models. And they really weren't very familiar with the 2D models. And they also weren't familiar with how their deliverables would be different than they would in a traditional 1D modeling process where the maps were prepared with 1D models. So then these are the kind of the outreach documents we prepared. One is managing the floodplain with 2D modeling. Also a fact sheet, a very short fact sheet of about 3 pages that shows kind of the difference between 1 and 2D modeling. We prepared a document highlighting the community role in the mapping process, and then we also have a document that summarized those community interviews. And that's all on our Flood Science Center webpage. So here's a little bit about the fact sheet that we prepared. This is the cover of that. And the basic comparison is that with 1D modeling, you have cross sections along the selected flooding sources. Now, 2D modeling is more of a mesh-based framework that it covers all the flooding sources in that watershed. Here's kind of the 1D steady state modeling, it kind of how you see it if you were opening the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers HEC RAS tool, and it shows some of the graphics that are available in that tool. On the left, it shows the layout with the cross sections, and on the right, you see one particular cross section and what the graphics show about that. And that's, again, one of the major differences is it shows your data at individual cross sections along the stream corridor. Another interesting kind of thing, too, is that when you model it, you're modeling it usually from the downstream to the upstream end of your system. In 2D hydraulic models, you can see there's a grid that's placed over the watershed, and the density of the grid varies. If you in rural areas, it can be much larger grid cells. In urban areas, it's a much tighter framework. And you see on the right here where it shows not only do you get flood elevations with the 2D models, but you get velocity. And here it shows the velocity of flood waters going through a bridge, kind of a bridge, basically. And you can see how since the water's funneled, the velocity is much higher through that bridge. Here's another graphic kind of showing the difference between 1 and 2D modeling. Again, here on the left, it shows the cross sections, and you see the little inset up in the upper right of that shows how it's by cross section. Whereas on the right, it shows a 2D model in the grid kind of layout, which is different. Here's an example of showing comparison between 1 and 2D modeling. Again, the cross sections on the left. On the right, you can see how it actually shows a split flow situation much better. So there's a separate floodway than on the right-hand side there. And it's got more detailed floodplain boundaries because of the size of the grid cells. It's much smaller than if you interpolate between cross sections. And one thing I also want to mention is a little bit about base level engineering. It's often conducted actually pre-discovery, and we'll talk about the phases of the mapping process. It's conducted for entire watersheds, and it's often used for unmapped areas and Zone A areas that don't have base flood elevations. Usually it started out being done with 1D modeling, but now it's almost always with 2D modeling. Another aspect I want to mention a little bit is on green on grid models. That's a 2D modeling process where they apply a rainfall event over a watershed. And here you can see how that watershed is laid out. It'll show based on soil types, you'll have a certain amount of infiltration. It includes the topographic data to show your kind of flow accumulation grid that occurs. Land use is an important factor because that's how you get they use the input the roughness information into a 2D model is through the land use data layer. And it's often the National Land Cover data set, but sometimes actually they can use develop their own set of polygons that does that. But the challenge with that, it's hard to replicate that for another remodeling effort. Here's a rain on grid model that was developed in the Marengo River watershed in northern Wisconsin. It was a project with the Wisconsin Wetland Association and NOAA. And it shows that here it shows the water represented in the stream corridor, but you can also see there's the water mounts in the upper parts of the watershed. So you can kind of see where some shallower flooding might occur in upper parts of a watershed. This is another product we developed. This is a community role. And here that shows the mapping process. And we wanted to highlight that it's really in this our documentation, one of the major things we found when we talked to communities that early on they thought they didn't really know what questions to ask, and they were kind of waited to kind of see some of the initial products. And the challenge is by then sometimes it's difficult for the contractor to incorporate those comments. If they've already developed work maps, they're in a process of putting in like new TOPA or even LOMARs. At that time is much more difficult because they have to rerun those models. And so setting up those models is a expensive part of the process. And so the input is really important at the early in the process. So what questions to ask? Usually it's what topographic data they're going to be using. It's now often LiDAR, but sometimes communities have more updated LiDAR that is appropriate to use. What land use data they're using, and if they're not using the National Land Cover data set, what land use data are they using and how did they derive those polygons? And then bridges and culverts. So often they community has more up-to-date information on bridge and culvert replacements that are really valuable in the process. And again, bridge early on, sometimes they used to do a 1D, 2D modeling combination where the 1D modeling was for the stream corridor and the 2D model was for the flood fringe areas, because initially the HEC RAS 2D model couldn't incorporate bridges and culverts very well. It was basically a combination of culverts you could use to replicate a bridge. The newer versions of that model handle bridges much better, and so that makes a much better product. And then one of the basic questions is, did they validate the model? Are there high watermarks they used, or how did they come up with these flood elevations, and what information was used to test it against a real world event? And that's where high watermarks are really valuable. And then, early on the project, who is on the project team, and, what is the timeline? So they know, the drop dead dates for certain information to be inputted. And then it's really valuable. A number of communities actually hired consultants to help them look at the model and be able to open and run the model to make sure that it met the community's needs. And that was one community actually had a standing review team that included representatives from the Corps of Engineers and other technical groups that supported the community. And so that was very helpful. And then, at the kickoff meeting, to make sure that all the LOMARs are properly incorporated. We have one community that said, well, they didn't incorporate this LOMAR, and that's there was an area filled in the community where they're proposing to develop, and that wasn't properly represented. And then confirm if you had any questions that were asked during discovery to see that the answers were satisfactory. And then again, seeking a consultant to help is really important. And then we have a publication on how you manage development. And I'm going to give a little spiel here on floodways. That's one topic that I focused on in my career with ASFPM. And here you have the special flood hazard area, and you've got the floodway, and then there's you can apply a surcharge. FEMA has something in their regulations that basically allow you to use a 1 foot surcharge, up to 1 foot surcharge, which means as the fringe gets developed, it actually can cause the flood elevations to increase by up to a foot. And when you think of that initially, that's kind of strange that they would allow increased flooding, but the view was that they could at least limit any increases to a foot. Prior to that, you'd have some development that could cause a more than a foot of increase, and so they set that 1 foot standard because that would at least cap those increases. And this shows kind of how they did it. They put in the model, you place some imaginary walls that are quote unquote frictionless walls. And you can raise that up to a foot and keep pinching in your model until that 1 foot surcharge is hit. The challenge is that surcharge doesn't stay in the floodway. It actually goes out into the special in the flood fringe area and actually beyond the special flood hazard area. And we did find a report that was produced in 1978 by James Goddard that kind of talked about the origin and how this was established. James Goddard is, by the way, when they have the Goddard White Award, this is Gilbert White and James Goddard is who they're named after. And one of the reasons they developed that early on is that James Goddard was from the Tennessee Valley Authority. And in the Tennessee Valley, they had very steep side slopes. And so they really had trouble with, if they mapped the whole floodplain as floodway, there wouldn't be much areas to develop. So that's when they came up with this 1 foot surcharge concept. It was kind of developed because they said, well, you can't, according to Goddard, you can't come up with a flood elevation better than plus or minus a foot. So that's how they set that 1 foot. But in actuality, that's kind of mixing absolute impacts versus relative impacts, which anyway, that's how they came up with the 1 foot. And according to Goddard, it was intended to be a minimum criteria that they're in urbanizing areas and where existing development, a much smaller rise would be appropriate. So some states said, yeah, well, we agree. We're not going to go with 1 foot. We're going to go with something much less. And so Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois came up with a concept of kind of a measurable amount. And that was a tenth of a foot. And Illinois actually included a velocity component, so you couldn't increase a velocity by more than 10%. When I was with the state of Wisconsin, and I'm used to this kind of a hundredth of a foot surcharge, and I was really surprised to learn that in New Jersey they have a 0.2 of a foot surcharge requirement. They also have a higher standard for actually the flows that are used in their modeling process. And then Minnesota, Montana, and Colorado came up with a 0.5 foot surcharge as kind of a middle ground. Again, I came from Wisconsin. It's like, how big an impact is a 1 foot surcharge floodway? At least in the one dimensional world, we kind of looked at some case studies across the country. We had 8 areas we looked at. And this is kind of we hired an engineer to do an analysis and looked at these. And the width decrease from a natural floodway varied from anywhere from 32% up to 68%. So from 1/3 to 2/3 was our results. And it, on average, it turned out to be a 50% decrease in the width of the natural floodway by using the surcharge. You can see also a velocity increase, and it increased the size of the floodplain by 10%. Here's an example in Wisconsin with a 0 surcharge or 1/100th of a foot surcharge floodway, and then overlain with a 1 foot surcharge floodway. So you can see how much it shrunk in the natural floodway. And if you look closely, there's a red line that shows actually how it increased. If you apply 1 foot of fill in this floodway fringe, it would actually push out the size of the special flood hazard area. In 2D modeling, 1 foot surcharge floodways it's more accurate because it accounts for loss of storage. They're typically wider, and there's surcharge challenges of meeting that 1 foot surcharge limit, even if you make it wider. And there's no rise challenges, and I'll show you a little bit about that. Here's an example where, if you can see, this was, I'm zooming in, where on the right, that's the 2 foot 2D floodway. And you can see there's spots where even doing that, within that, there's a increase of greater than a foot. And when it comes to no rise, they in particular had issues with bridges. where there was an example in at Boulder Creek in Colorado, where there were, I think it's Highway 10, they were increasing from a 2-lane to 4-lane between Boulder and Denver. And they couldn't get a no rise at that bridge as they modeled it for an increase to 4 lanes. And at one point, they were actually talking about having to go from a 4-lane to a 2-lane to a 4-lane again to avoid this rise. Instead, what they did is they came up with this concept of an evaluation line. And it was intended to represent kind of what in a 1D model, you have a cross section and the flood elevation is established as kind of an average across that cross section. And this was a way of kind of taking a 2D results, and I could kind of say this, but dumbing down the results a bit so that you could get this averaging process in the 2D modeling effort. And here's kind of a graphic that FEMA actually prepared that kind of, it used these evaluation lines were comparable to cross sections. And on the map, they made BFE, they put these evaluation lines usually where there's a whole foot BFE. And you can see that on the legend on the maps, it showed how they're different. And here's a zoom in of that, where the evaluation is a dashed line and base flood elevations are a squiggly line. Here it shows it with a lettered, like it does with a cross section, but in many cases they use just asterisk and instead of letters or sometimes numbers to kind of show they're different than cross sections. And then they put footnotes in the floodway data table, because the floodway data table doesn't handle a grid results very well. And here's a footnote. You can't read that very well, so I'm zooming in a little bit so you can see it. And it says, values reported are based on averages calculated across the evaluation lines. And that's what most communities really weren't aware of until after they had the maps already. And it says here, the floodway is computed by a 2D or hybrid 1D, 2D model. So the challenges with 2D for communities is it's a grid versus a vector data process. And so when you look at the flood insurance study, is numbers along these evaluation lines or results along these evaluation lines, where in actuality, there's a grid that shows the evaluations across that whole watershed. They're large, often 20 gigabytes or greater. There's no rise analysis are a challenge, like I mentioned to you, and there's no cross sections. And so sometimes communities used to find ways to look at a flood profile and look between cross sections and come up with elevations for structures between cross sections. Well, in a 2D model, there are no cross sections. And so if you have the ability, you can look at the grid and get the results, and that's quite accurate, but communities often don't have the capability for doing that. Often it's unsteady flow, especially if it's a rain-on grid, and the runtime can be very long. Unless you've got a very good internet connection or a very good processor, I guess it's more the processor, since you hopefully have the model already on your computer or a computer. Mentioned the floodways are a challenge, and that's why they came up with valuation lines. And then non-engineers and many engineers are not familiar with 2D modeling. Of all the engineers in the United States, there's probably only about 10% of those that really know H&H, hydrology and hydraulics associated with floodplain mapping. And of that 10%, there's probably only 10% of those, or maybe 20%, that are familiar with 2D modeling. So the number of engineers that are familiar with it is not as large. This is kind of a listing of the functions by the community and floodplain administrator. It shows map adoption is important. But then the issue of accessing and managing the modeling as you move forward, and then storing digital copies of the results, that's, again, can be very large. And so you may have to have a separate hard disk that you would store this information on. And important, I think, especially in this world of uncertainty with FEMA, to make sure that you've got a copy of that model and it's available to you, and not depending necessarily entirely on FEMA to archive the results. Challenges for the community is getting access and downloading the model. If it's a download, and usually it's best to get it on a separate hard disk. Storing digital copies, again, large files. How to maintain the modeling, and as you know, communities, as somebody comes in with a development proposal and they want to do a LOMAR, how do you maintain that? And then again, there's no cross sections and no flood profile. So in some cases, they were told to kind of straight line it between evaluation lines, and if you have a structure between evaluation lines, you can come up with a evaluation line that way. But often, you know, if you've got slopes and abrupt changes in elevation between those evaluation lines, that can be quite inaccurate. And if evaluation lines are used for a no rise, that they can only be used if no insurable structures are impacted. So if the community's got to make sure that if somebody's doing a no rise and they're signing off on it, that engineer that did that no rise it made sure that there was no insurable structures that were impacted. That if you don't do that, that kind of does open the community for liability issues. And then, so when it comes to the 2D modeling products, these are the tasks that have been completed, where we kind of reviewed and got copies of FEMA models, and we actually hired a consultant that he had some other 2D models that he could test that were in addition to those that we got from FEMA. We interviewed the communities that have received maps with 2D model, and then we developed those 2D modeling outreach materials that I mentioned, and these are on our website. And we've got some tasks underway. We've got a training needs assessment that was conducted, and a training for floodplain managers that's being developed, and that Bill Brown is going to be talking about next. So here's a QR code that you can use to locate on our website the outreach materials that were developed. And now I'll turn it over to Bill. By the way, I'm retiring at the end of this month, so this is probably one of my last presentations for the association on when it comes to mapping and mapping issues. So I'm going to stop editing now, or stop sharing now.
Okay, Alan, this is Kevin. Thank you very much. I know we do have a little bit of a pop quiz for people before we move on. So Bill, just bear with me a moment. We're going to have a kind of a simple multiple choice question for folks. Go ahead and read through it, select your option. We'll evaluate those answers and move on. So take a minute. Go ahead and weigh in when you're ready, everybody. Okay, I'm going to close down the poll. Bear with me. Okay, hopefully you all can see that. Overwhelmingly responding with the third option there. If you're attending and you didn't get in your answer, don't worry. You'll have another opportunity at the end to respond to a poll. So don't worry too much about that. But anyway, thanks for engaging with us there. Bill, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, can you see that, Kevin?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, I'll get moving on here.
Yep.
As Alan pointed out, as I'll be talking about the 2D training for floodplain managers. Initially, during the 2D outreach efforts, we identified a need for a 2D training. And one of those came up is how do you use this information? Obviously, many of the communities that had received it that we talked to didn't have any knowledge of it. And typically you would go out and get training, but from a training perspective, All the training that we found so far is basically how to build a 2D model or run a 2D model, and it's not actually how to use or read the information. So you need to know what kinds of training were needed along those lines, but also go from there. So we put together a flash survey last fall in November, December, sent it out to our ASFPM membership, and anybody else essentially who we had an email for. And I do want to note that, one thing that would make before I get into this, some states that are doing a lot of 2D work do make their information available online, but this is focused for those communities that want to know how to look at the data they received or don't have those opportunities from their home state. So let me see if it'll move forward now. Okay, there we go. The response was actually to the survey was really good. We got more than 600 respondents. About 48% of the respondents, 47% respondents being employed in local government, 13.5% by state government, 32% by industry consultants. About 7.6% had other employment, NGO, academic, federal, something along those lines. But we did ask a question of those others: did they have any experience with 2D models? Of that, about 2.8% of those responding in the other group said yes, they did have some experience. The other 4.8% indicated they had no 2D. From those groups, then when we started looking at each group, were asked similar questions focused on their perceived 2D responsibilities and actions, but the important questions focused on what would be the training needs for local floodplain managers. So from there, those state responses, state employees were asked if communities in their states needed 2D training and what type of training was needed. 30 of the responding state and people who had worked for the state did not identify any recommended training needs. But of those that did respond to the question, 2% indicated no community training for 2D model was necessary. 80.4% indicated a basic understanding of 2D model data is needed. 70.6% indicated how to review and assess a 2D model results was a critical issue. 37% indicated how to run a 2D model was important for locals. 41 indicated the need to know how to create or maintain a 2D model, and almost 20% indicated other needs, 2D. The majority of those others comments could be identified as much more specific, descriptions of the actions listed previously. So it was kind of still all in that realm of understanding how to access and use the data. So there were some interesting comments, though, and I will point out that one comment acknowledged the value of trainings, but indicated that advanced training would be helpful for state staff. So not only were they indicating that this would be helpful for locals, but many of the state people would need the training too. Additionally, one comment questioned local floodplain managers' capacity to understand 2D modeling. Well, I don't fall in that realm, but I did find it interesting that somebody didn't think that local floodplain managers were capable of doing this aspect of things. But moving on with the response, actually, the locals were pretty much the ones that would have to do this. Local government employees were the largest group that responded to the flash survey. Of those responding, about a little over half, 50.5%, indicated 2D models are currently or will be utilized in their community. So those that indicated the current or pending 2D model use were asked a bunch of training needs questions. Those questions are the summaries are there, but 4.7% indicated no 2D hydraulic model training was necessary. Almost 70% indicated that basic understanding of 2D hydraulic models, how does the model work, what's the data used, that kind of information was important. About 74% indicated how to review and assess the 2D model results. How do you look at how do you look at elevation lines, velocity information, floodways, etc. 74% indicated how to use 2D models for project and permit review. So there was a lot of people who were asking questions about how to do this. And from a permit review aspect of it, is how do you determine the BFE elevation? No rise analysis, use it for no rise, using the elevation lines, because that was something that they were completely unfamiliar with. 58% indicated how to maintain the 2D model itself, is how do you share an effective model? How do you incorporate new development or those revisions like a LOMAR or project impacts? And then how do they handle CLOMAR, LOMAR activities in that? There were about 9% indicated other aspects related to 2D, but again, they were very similar to some of the specific questions rather than the generic overviews that were listed previously. From a training, from the consultant perspective, this is the second largest group of respondents, and they were asked if their firms had any involvement in the development or a review of 2D models utilizing floodplain mapping, and nearly 77% of the respondents indicated yes. Then that 77% then were asked if their firm supported communities' review of 2D models, and only 48% indicated yes of that group. So there's a lot of people who are involved but may not be supporting local communities. Anybody who responded that they were involved in 2D models then were asked a series of questions about community training needs. 84% of the group responded to the training questions. Of those, and 24% indicated that their firm provided no support to communities. 47% indicated their firm provided explanations of basic 2D model data and functions to communities. 55% indicated their firm provided review and assessment of 2D models for various communities. 13% indicated that their firm provided training in some degree on how to basically review or handle the 2D models. 15% indicated their firm provided training on how to use 2D models for floodplain management activities. So some of the gist of meeting the floodplain requirements. About almost 9% indicated their firm provided training on how to update and maintain 2D models, and almost 10% indicated their firm provided some other type of support for 2D models. Now, a lot of, this is a quick survey, so not a lot of detail involved, but at least it gave us a pretty good view of this. So from a 2D perspective, the flash survey provided a lot of good, consistent feedback, and it was obvious from all the responses that training is needed, and it provided insight as to what kinds of training was necessary. The 2D training being developed, the first phase for our endeavor here was to, this needs assessment, that survey, but it was also to search for any kind of existing trainings. As I indicated before, we didn't find a whole lot of information for people how to actually look at the data. Almost everything is how to build or run the model. So one of the things is, as far as the training that we're developing, it will not be training for how to create a 2D model or run the 2D model. It will focus on how to use the data generated by a 2D model to do floodplain management functions. If somebody wants to know how to run the model, there are those courses out there, and there are training opportunities for people to learn how to run a 2D or to create a 2D model. This is more focused for those individuals who don't have that function, but they need to know how to use the data, or how to at least review and get a basic understanding. So one of the first things we did also is to establish an advisory committee that comprised of consultants, state staff, and local flood managers. It's a mix of technical and non-technical folks, and it's based upon the feedback and the advisory committee and support. The training program outline has been developed. So with that, the training program outline is essentially this. It's going to break down to be about 11 modules or lessons, depending. I use the term modules. The training folks use the term lessons, but from our perspective, we're doing it from module based. The first module will basically be an introductory, covering what the training purpose is and the need for it. Modules 2 through 5 are basically basic knowledge and application model, and then modules 10 through 10 are kind of advanced use. Module 11 will be examples or practical exercises. And again, this is not floodplain management, just like it's not training to do how to run or develop a 2D model. It is also not a floodplain management 101 course. they're assuming that those who are coming to take this training understand what their responsibilities of a floodplain manager is and what they're supposed to do, and then how to use we're going to try to provide insight on how you can use this data to do your response, to meet your responsibilities as a local floodplain manager. And we provide an understanding of the models, provide how to get the information from the models, and how to use them as part of their permit review process. So moving on, one of the things, as we do this is the training when it is developed will be deployed through ASFPM's LMS, Learning Management System. That will be the primary mechanism. But we are aware of that there are individuals or there's chapters or there's areas in the country where they would like to have potentially a course taught at their chapter meeting or something like that, or just something deployed. So we are keeping that into consideration, that we could deploy this in person to a degree with a limit, not the full course, but a limited access, or basically to meet the minimum needs out there, or maybe even advanced needs. But that will be determined after the course is completely developed. The training initially will focus on HEC-RAS and Flow2D, and how to open and view and visualize the data with free open source systems. Now, I realize that Flow2D does cost, but they do have mechanisms where you can access it and export the data out through some apps that you can load into QGIS or some other thing, QGIS being a free GIS open source form. So the goal is to basically have the initial model for this released later this year. I would again like to point out that some of this data is available in various sources. I saw Tim Murphy from Maricopa had posted that they've been doing a 2D analysis, and I know they run, at least I think they still run Flow 2D. So I may be coordinating with the folks out in the Southwest for their insight and input on this. But this is focused for training for those individuals who don't have those resources, but have that kind of data that's being provided to them. So there's a little bit of an insight of what this is going to develop. A lot of it's going to be basically going through, but it's going to be a much more hands-on visual example of how to access the 2D model and develop it. The training will be finding. So, one of the first things with the second lesson, the first lesson is an overview. Second lesson is the basics, the 100 level understanding of what's in a 2D model. But the third lesson is actually, how do you open up a model? How do you start looking at, looking at the data? So as an example here, you'll notice on the screen here, oops, gotta get the laser pointer. This is basically the HEC-RAS interface. I've obviously got a file I loaded. I did see somebody talking about St. Vrain, Alan had mentioned earlier. This is actually data from that model. And basically, going in and going to show somebody how to find where the project file is and open it up. And then once they get it open, what is it, how do you look on the left side of the screen here? What are the features? What's in there? Once it's, what can you hear? Right now, this is obviously the St. Vrain Creek River, whatever, I can't remember which is in Colorado. But we'll explain, the features. At this one right now, we have the terrain data is turned on and the river is turned on. But, if you're a local floodplain manager, the first thing you typically want to know is, where's the floodplain? So this basically explain how you go through, click on the features to turn on find the 100-year flood boundaries, turn it on, and go from there. Obviously, this is it. It does have the gradation from a color so that you can find out, kind of what the depth is. But one of the things that we'll explain, and I saw some of the questions earlier, how do you use a profile sheet or something along those lines. The unique aspects about the 2D model is that an elevation is created in every cell or every grid section. So you can actually, by highlighting the feature itself, you can move in, and as you move around, this is just a picture, but one I took a screenshot because I put the mouse right here, and you'll notice that if you put it there, pretend that this was live, for 48, 33.9. That was the elevation, and you look over here at the legend, here it gives you a range of the elevations out there. So this will kind of give you an idea of, as you move around, you would have that. But, local floodplain manager who's never opened this up doesn't know that. So this is kind of the stuff that we're going to be teaching and training them. Similarly, we've got turn on the floodway. Obviously, when you look at the floodway here, you notice this color. The color differential is the floodway because the floodway reflects the surcharge. So that here's the surcharge limit, and this is what's going on here. And then you'll know that this would be the floodway boundary. You could also turn off the floodplain boundary and then just show the floodway. But, these are the types of things we'll show and demonstrate in the course. Now, this is, all in elevation, but what if we want to know depths? We have the ability to turn on the depth, turn off everything else, turn on depth, and then we see the depth grids for that's out there. And as Alan pointed out earlier, it does do velocity information. This is something that typically we don't really pay a whole lot of attention to, but it is something that is available. And then you can see what the velocities are out here. Obviously, through the bridge opening here, tends to run fairly quickly. So these are the type of training that we'll kind of go through to explain, and a lot slower than what I've talked about, but it'll go through and explain to people how they can do this and find this information so they can use it for their day-to-day floodplain management, permit review, identifying a BFE, that type of material and that type of information. So I went through fairly quickly, but I want to provide my next speaker a lot of time. And Alan went long, so we'll go from there. And again, my name was up there earlier, but if any questions, I'm going to be here. I'll ask questions. I'll answer anybody who put in a chat, or we'll go from there. But with that, that's all I've got. I'm going to go over here and stop sharing. And here it's back to you, Kevin.
All right. Thanks, Bill. That was great. Really appreciate it. We do have a bunch of questions. We'd like to allow our third speaker, Sydney, to have as much time as she may need. So we're going to roll right into that presentation, and then we'll hold questions until the end. So if you asked something already, bear with us. We'll have that Q&A period at the end here. Thanks so much.
Okay, I believe I'm sharing the correct screen. Is that right, Kevin?
Yeah, it looks good. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me. I'm Sydney Roberts. I'm the with the Missouri State Emergency Management Agency, where I serve as the CTP coordinator for the state of Missouri. Today, I wanted to talk about something that may not get enough airtime at some of these exchanges, not on the modeling itself, but what happens when you must take the 2D results and actually bring the communities along with you in those discussions. So, the outreach side and the communication friction that we're all facing, and some of the regulatory territory that we're all also currently navigating without a complete roadmap. So just going to jump right into it. So I think the main core issue for most of us is that 1D has decades of institutional comfort behind it. Communities know what a cross section is. They know what a 1D floodplain looks like on a firm. So the process is familiar, even if they may not always love the results. And that's where a 2D rain-on mesh really throws a wrench in that, because it's not an updated 1D study. It's a fundamentally different way of computing flood risk because it's watershed wide and not just within the SFHA conveyances. And so when those communities do see the results that extend well beyond what their old map showed, their first reaction isn't curiosity, it's more resistance. So the biggest communication challenge, and this is usually the one that catches people off guard, is the pluvial flooding with a P. Explaining that to a community that the water trying to get to the SFHA is now part of their risk picture is a complete paradigm shift in the industry. And that's what we're really dealing with. And so to put at scale of what we're dealing with in Missouri is that if FEMA does allow us to stay the course and complete the risk to get to a final regulatory product, the state of Missouri will have 82 of 114 counties with 2D regulatory products. So that's a complete statewide transition for us. And getting the outreach right at that massive of a scale is exactly why we're here today. So just want to highlight what actually makes 2D different, because that really is the core foundation of every outreach and communication challenge that follows. So I throw this graphic in here because it's really worth pausing on. This is what we explain, or how we explain, the transition to our communities. And quite frankly, to really anyone who asks, well, why did you move away from 1D? Looking at the left side in a 1D model, the user is making a bunch of assumptions about nearly every hydraulic model variable. So your flow direction, your flow paths, channel roughness, etc. But then on the right side, those 2D computes those variables for you. So the model ends up solving those at nearly every element across the entire watershed. Channel roughness is still assumed, but it's assigned at each computational element rather than being applied uniformly between those cross sections. And that really is a meaningful distinction. And then there's the momentum. 1D doesn't account for it, but 2D does. And when you're talking about water moving across a very complex floodplain that, maybe there's overbank flows, ponding, water routing around structures, that momentum really matters. And that's not a minor technical footnote, which is why the results look very different. And that's why we have to help communities understand before they ever see a map in front of them. So how do we handle that? Really, our core principle is pretty simple. Engagement starts at project initiation, not at flood risk review, not even at your CCO meeting. It's day one, because by the time any product arrives in front of those community officials, they've already had multiple touch points and they've already heard all the buzzwords. So when they see how that model works at a higher level, none of that data, none of the maps that come to them, it's not a surprise. And it's just really confirmation of something that they already have context for. We also treat staff turnover as a constant and not an exception. Every phase of the project gets delivered as if it's their first exposure, because often it is. A floodplain administrator who was with you with the initial kickoff meeting isn't always necessarily going to be with you when the preliminary products are issued. And that's really just the reality of local government. So we essentially build and integrate our trainings into each and every community meeting. And the ultimate goal is to have a better informed and prepared communities and not just notified ones. So when we sit down with a community and explain why we moved to 2D, we like to focus on three things. First being the terrain representation. These models are LiDAR driven, so it has a much better description of the landscape at a much higher level of detail that makes the results visually believable to a non-technical audience. Second, where the computations happen. In 1D, you're computing at those cross sections along the conveyance. Everything in between those cross sections are interpolated, but in 2D, you're computing at all of those mesh cells across the entire watershed, which is a completely different resolution of risk. And then third, and this is the framing that we use with our communities, is that the goal isn't to overwhelm them with modeling talk. The goal is essentially informed acceptance. We want them to understand enough about how the mesh works, how the rain falls on it, and how the water moves through it, that when they see their flood risk results for the first time, that they trust it. And that's really the bar that we're aiming for. Part of that trust building is essentially being transparent about what all goes into the model. We never skip the inputs conversation whenever we give our presentations. We explain that 2D provides analysis throughout the SFHA, and it captures the rain falling across the entire watershed that's trying to get to the SFHA. And that's really the bridge from a traditional floodplain thinking to a watershed-wide risk thinking. The inputs we walk communities through include the LIDAR, rainfall, land use, break lines, hydro connectors, and building footprints that essentially get raised as 3D obstructions in our models to allow the rain to go around them. And that last one really tends to land pretty well with our officials because it's intuitive. And so, why does this matter for our outreach? It's because when a community later looks at their draft data and sees the water routed around those structures or pooling in a low spot, they understand why this is happening. We've given them the vocabulary, and we're making sure that our supplemental products are usable rather than just being another deliverable. Okay, so standard FEMA risk scopes typically cover the fluvial or the flood risk along those conveyance paths that get incorporated into the SFHAs. Those are those green areas on the graphic above. That's the regulatory product, and that's what our communities are typically used to receiving. What 2D radon mesh gives us is that you get the risk along the drainage paths that are leading to that SFHA or the red that's in this screenshot. So you get those ponding areas that are also completely disconnected from the SFHA and the water that never makes it to the map floodplain, but absolutely does flood properties. And so for the first time, our communities can see the full extent of their risk and have a comprehensive picture of what's going on at their watershed. So basically everything from the top of the hill down. And now the pluvial products are supplemental and they can be used as best available data, but they don't, however, replace the regulatory firm. They do fill that product, which those standard products just weren't originally designed to address. And for building more resilient communities, addressing that gap matters immensely. So our position at FEMA is that if you're running a 2D study, supplemental products should be the minimum responsible delivery. So I'm talking about your water surface elevation rasters, your depth rasters, DEMs, building footprints, and your freeboard grids. These all exist as outputs of the modeling process, whether a community knows how to ask for them or not, and our job is just to bring them to the surface. The goal is to put the flood risk data in front of any user with an internet connection, no requirements beyond their willingness just to point and click. They shouldn't need any GIS software, no engineering background, no consultant required. Everyone should have access to their flood risk from the floodplain administrator all the way down to the residents. And then for other CTPs that may be on this call, if your 2D scope isn't producing and delivering some of these products, I definitely encourage y'all to start having this conversation amongst yourselves and even with your regions, because the data exists, but really the question is it reaching the right people? Okay, so what does that actually look like for us? Here in Missouri, we've built two separate public-facing web portals. We have a project site that houses all of our working draft data, and then we'll have an effective site that's going to store all the effective data. Again, no license and no expertise is going to be required for either one. So our project site is live right now, and it houses all the project data, and this includes our project files, so any past meeting recordings, PowerPoint, sign-in sheets, agendas, anything like that. SFHAs, we also have a changes since last firm layer that essentially provides communities with a comparison of the draft against the effective. Those hydro connectors, break lines, eval lines, building footprints, rasters, all of which are available 24/7. The effective site is where all of our data is eventually going to migrate to at LFD when we have a high level of confidence that the data is not going to change. So this site will contain all the final data sets, including the additional supplemental data sets, such as our depth rasters and our freeboard grids. The site is fully built and functional, but it's not yet in full launch. We're currently working through a cloud storage and imagery server solution before we get there, because whenever all of our active projects reach completion, we'll be sitting on something of roughly 10 terabytes of flood risk data statewide. And just currently, our state infrastructure isn't built for that. So we're currently pursuing our own storage and imagery server solution. In the meantime, the data isn't sitting idle. It's still accessible through a supplemental folder on the MIP for those who need it. What the effective site solves is basically usability. For now, the project site alone already gets us most of the way to our access goal. A floodplain administrator, building department staffer, community planner, whoever, just really anyone who wants to know what their risk is, they can pull up a water surface elevation raster right now without having to call anyone. Because before, the standard for access is, you had to call your community official or hire a consultant. And we wanted to get that down to here, just bookmark this page. And so that's the bar we've set and something that we're continuing to build forward. Okay, so now I'm pivoting towards floodway development, because 2D floodway development is still one of those areas where we don't have clear guidance on, and everyone is kind of figuring out, their own processes. So I just wanted to take a brief moment to go over our own standard operating procedure. To start, we do develop a depth times velocity raster, and from there we compute a mean DV value for each evaluation line that extends across the 1% floodplain and crosses a single conveyance path. If an evaluation line happens to cross more than one, we'll split the floodways. From there, we develop a mean DV contour. These are typically at 0.5, 0.75, 1, and 1.25 thresholds, though it really varies depending on the floodplain slope and characteristics. We build a polygon from those contours and raise the terrain outside of the polygon to force the conveyance through that floodway, and then compute the water surface elevations within the floodway polygon. From there, we'll also develop a surcharge raster, which is basically the floodway water surface elevation minus the 1%, and compute the average surcharges across each evaluation line. And we're essentially assessing those raster points and evaluation lines against a tolerance of 0 to 1 foot, and iterating on the floodway polygon shape using the DV contours as guides until the surcharge tolerances are met. It is an iterative process, and it does take time, but it does produce a defensible and a documented 2D floodway. So if it's not something your program currently has documented, it's definitely something that is worth developing in the future. Okay, so now I'm gonna go over the policy gap that we're all facing. Profiles in the FIS are optional for 2D studies. We're not doing them here in Missouri. Evaluation lines are essentially going to replace our cross sections as the regulatory data product. And this is a critical distinction because in 1D, regulatory data is the product of computations at cross sections, versus in 2D, the regulatory data is going to be a product of creating a raster of computations at every mesh cell, and the evaluation lines are essentially the water surface elevation contours of that raster. So those evaluation lines are going to carry every same regulatory precedence of a cross section. The issue with that is that FEMA guidelines and standards language hasn't fully caught up with this new reality. So we are working on getting NFIP training materials modified to accommodate the raster-based floodplain management, but there's still going to be gaps and we're going to be operating in those gaps every day. So our advice is just to document clearly and consistently so that when the guidance eventually does catch up with us, you want to have a paper trail with you that shows what your process was, so you have that defensible argument. So, as mentioned, NFIP regulations still require BFE interpolation between cross sections. That's a traditional framework. You have two cross sections, you interpolate linearly between them. That water surface elevation raster is going to replace that with a direct model output at every point within the floodplain. It's going to be a point and click, and you have a BFE. There's no interpolation. There's no assumption that the water surface behaves linearly between two locations. We're also training our floodplain administrators how to use this raster alongside the evaluation lines as a reasonableness check. And I will tell you that this is something that our floodplain administrators are absolutely excited about. Just having the ability to go in and pull a BFE at any parcel, any location without having to manually interpolate or call an engineer is certainly transforming their day-to-day workflow, especially in Zone A's. It is more accurate, and when you're documenting for any LOMARs, permits, elevation certificates, having that direct model output as your reference is going to be a much stronger position than interpolating from a profile, because you are going to be 1 degree closer to the actual answer, because that raster, it should be a 1-to-1 with the model. So, speaking on no-rise certifications, this is a common question that we get from our communities and our engineers who are looking on working with these products more. And so this is just kind of an overview of how we handle it. Evaluation lines are created at 0.1 foot increments and filtered to create a regulatory raster that sits within 0.1 to 0.2 feet of the model raster. That filtered data set is your manageable regulatory surface. At transportation crossings, this is where it gets really important, is that most structures create that drawdown through the impacted reach. So our regulatory evaluation line data set captures that first evaluation line upstream and that first evaluation line downstream of the structure. Each one extending across the full width of the floodplain. The regulatory raster between those two straight lines is, or between those two lines is a straight line interpolation. What that does is place the model results below the regulatory surface through that reach, and that gap between the regulatory surface and that model output is essentially going to be your window of opportunity. Modifications can be made and still produce model results that don't exceed the regulatory surface, meaning that no increase in regulatory value. Hence, that's giving our Department of Transportation a fighting chance at obtaining a no-rise. The one exception is that if a structure exists within that reach, you're going to need a no impact result at that building specifically. And so, the reach level window doesn't really cover you there. The same logic applies to reaches that aren't at conveyance crossings. So just make sure you're documenting your processes and just know where your windows are, so to speak. So now touching on some lessons learned, what's actually been working for us in Missouri is, again, that early and often engagement is really the single biggest factor for us. The communities that came into their flood risk review meetings already understand that 2D paradigm shift and have had different conversations versus the communities that have seen it for the first time. It's really a night and day difference in the quality of back and forth dialogue and acceptance. Integrated trainings, just embedding that education into every community touch point versus scheduling a standalone training meant that the learning has compounded across the project lifecycle. so that by the time the preliminary products did roll out, we weren't introducing any new products or anything that they haven't already heard, but rather, we've just been reinforcing them. And the supplemental products themselves, just being able to hand a community a depth grid and a freeboard raster alongside their regulatory firm changes the conversation from compliance to planning. And that really is 100% worth all the effort. However, I will say what's hurt us the most is the sequencing. Like I mentioned earlier, we've built those two forward-facing web portals, more specifically, the effective portal that we created. This was developed after the data was already produced and delivered. And so, I'll admit that was a bit backwards, but really the infrastructure really should have been ready before the data arrives. So ideally have it scoped and stood up during production so that both the final delivery and access to the data happen simultaneously. Because when you do have that gap between the data completion and public access, you start to lose some of that momentum that you worked hard to build up. And, if I did have the ability to change one thing, it would be that. So, build the platform first, ensure the infrastructure is in place, and then fill it. So before I hand things back off to you, Kevin, I just wanted to check in and see how we're doing on time. I could always do a quick demo of our project site, but if not, my contact information is here on my screen, along with my staff's contact information. So, if there is anything from today that anyone has follow-up questions on, be it the outreach framework, the supplemental products we're developing, the floodway SOP, no rise, whichever, just don't hesitate to reach out to us. So, Kevin?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sydney. If you wouldn't mind, we've got about 12 minutes left rather, if you're up for a quick demo for a few minutes, and then we'll take a few questions.
Yeah,
that'd be
of
great.
course. Let me end that. Okay, so this is our project site where we're currently, again, hosting all of that working draft data. Again, I was just able to pull it up just fine. You don't need that username. You don't need a password. You just need to be able to have access to the link and have a good internet connection. Up here we got a search bar. We also have bookmarks to the right. Right now, we currently have our project status pulled up for the entire state. So, I-70 runs about midway through here. So basically, anything south of that is currently sitting in PMP or going through their 90-day comment and appeal or map adoption. Everything north is still working through data development or pre-discovery. So to focus on one area, I zoomed into Seneca, Missouri. It's in the southwest corner of the state. Currently have the special flood hazard areas turned on. If anybody's wanting to know what the different symbology or the different colors mean, you can just toggle one of these little triangles down and it'll give you that breakdown below. Also, what I mentioned earlier is how we have that changes since last firm. This will show you the comparison between that draft data and what's currently effective on their maps today. We also have that broken down. So green is basically a decrease, red is an increase, and then yellow is no change. It's a little slow to pull up, but maybe when I start turning some other things, it'll populate. Well, while that's going, up here at the chain link symbol next to the search bar, we do have county folders. Whenever you click on that link, it'll take you to all of our county's project documentation. Again, just focusing on Newton County, where Seneca, Missouri is based on. We have our meeting agendas, recordings, the actual PDF, anything associated with the project, throughout the duration of the project is going to be posted on the site. This also gives an overview of kind of how I mentioned that we train our communities. So talking about that LiDAR, talking about where we acquire the base map, develop the terrain, the differences in the cross sections, how much more accurate it is as compared to the old quad maps or the 10-meter profiles. Then there's that same screen grab that I included in my PowerPoint of, what we show the communities on the differences between the 1D and the 2D and why we made the switch. Doesn't look like it wants to load for me today, so this might be a pretty short demo if it's not going to work. And likewise with, we also have preliminary down here. The same setup as our data development. It's going to have very similar layers over here. They're going to have the same evaluation lines, streamlines. They'll also have the changes since last firm. If communities also want to share their feedback with us, they can do so directly by leaving a comment. So that second from the right button, they can just click on that. If it doesn't automatically pull up, it's usually because we don't have comments turned on in the support data window. But when you're able to select comments and turn those on, we usually have a series of dots that show up. Depending on the phase, each one will be associated with a color. So, red for your flood risk review, yellow for your discovery, blue for that preliminary CCO, modeling methods and extents. And it really is as simple as just click the dot, and anywhere on the map that they want to leave a comment with us, they certainly can. We typically treat these dots as basically a task list for us to review once we're through that comment period. And it doesn't look like our website is really wanting to cooperate too much today, and it might just be my internet connection because we're down here in a basement with no windows. So, but I mean, the website is pretty straightforward. You just don't be afraid to click around and really explore. For anybody, I think I went through that pretty quickly, but if anybody did want to explore it in their own time, this is the QR code that'll take you directly to that website. You can also do this bit.ly link and it'll take you to the same exact place. And if anybody, again, did have any questions about our site and questions about any of the layers that we have on there, want to discuss it further, again, just reach out to me. Contact information is here, or my staff, Patrick and Jacob, could also certainly answer any questions about our outreach site.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for that. That was fantastic. So we do have just about 5 or 6 minutes left. We've gotten a lot of questions during this presentation, which is great. We'll take a few now. I want to also mention, if you did ask a question earlier, check back in the Q&A feature. Bill, in particular, has been diligently answering as many questions as he can, so you may have an answer in writing there. And some of those that we don't get to today, we'll get you an answer in writing after the fact. We'll do our best to follow up with you on those. So having said all of that, I'm going to go way back to the beginning. And some of these questions came in, Alan, during your presentation. So, ostensibly for you, but anybody on the panel is welcome to chime in to answer here. So first question from Joseph is saying, when would 2D modeling be quote unquote required? Many analyses are due to a bridge replacement or a restudy of a short section of creek. How does the 2D fit into an existing, often older 1D model?
Well, if you want me to answer that, I can try. Basically, it's not, 2D modeling is not normally required. I know DOTs like to use this SRH2D because it helps with scour analysis, but there's no requirement for there to be a 2D model. The issue is, how do you tie it in? Usually you have to tie it in with hopefully within a half a foot. And sometimes it does look rather abrupt when you're changing from a 2D to a 1D, 1D to a 2D model. But I think it's within a half a foot is the requirement.
I see.
For the tie-in.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Now, Madison is asking, and again, this is open for anyone, but can you describe how newer versions of HEC-RAS model bridges and culverts are quote unquote better? So how are those better, and which version is better? So I don't know if there's a clean answer for that, but Madison's wondering about how that's defined and what models that is.
All I could say is, this is Alan again, is that 2D, when they first came out, would treat a bridge where you would put in culverts to try to match the same flow capacity. The latest versions, and I don't remember the numbering capacity, does allow bridges to be placed directly in, and that doesn't require you put culverts in. And that's why most people are transitioning from kind of a 1D, 2D combined model to strictly 2D, because they now can handle bridges much better.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. A couple of questions now for, I think, Sydney. Madison again is asking, what is the anticipated schedule for the Missouri 2D mapping updates for the 82 counties? And forgive me, Sydney, if you touched on that. I may have missed it, but just wondering what the schedule is there.
Yeah, not at all. It's a good question. Right now, our goal is to have those 82 counties ready by 2030, assuming that everything gets worked out at the federal level.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then Peter was asking, how large is the necessary cloud-based storage, and what is the cost, if you're willing to share?
So right now, because our projects are at various stages across the state, we're starting at 5 terabytes, and we're anticipating on growing 1 terabyte per year until we reach the max 10 terabyte threshold. As far as cost, I don't believe I have those numbers in front of me, but I think in total, by the time we get to the full 10 terabytes, I don't think it's going to be any more than 20,000 per year between the storage and the imagery server.
Okay, right. That's good to know. Thank you very much. Okay, we're just about out of time. Before I lose everybody, I'd like to take a moment and ask you all to just give our event today a quick rating. I would really appreciate that. So that kind of concludes our Q&A section here. I know there are some outstanding questions. Once again, I'll try to get those answers for you in writing. So I appreciate your patience on that front. And then, while you're taking a moment to respond to this, I just want to say thanks to everybody for taking time out of your afternoon to join us here, and to our panel of presenters as well. As a ton of great information. And in particular, Alan, this webinar series has had a ton of success over the years, largely due to his efforts in organizing it and often presenting, and really appreciate all the work. Alan, I know you're going to be doing a little bit of volunteering, but I hope you enjoy your retirement as well. So I think that's it for us this afternoon. Thank you again, everybody. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank for all those that put in nice comments. Thank you.